Good morning and welcome to the online services of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Swannanoa Valley. My name is Spence Foscue and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees. We thank you for joining us in these trying times and look forward to meeting in person when we can safely. It's Valentine's Day, February 14th, and we wish everyone a day full of love and Valentines. Here, we practice a non-creedal form of worship. Our individual beliefs are diverse, and hopefully our attitude toward each other's beliefs and traditions is one of tolerance and acceptance. Rather than focus on a doctrine or belief, we find primary significance in our shared agreement or covenant to affirm and promote the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. These may be found at our website, uusb.org. If you like, tune into our Zoom coffee hour immediately after the service. So let's start the service.
Thank you, Spence. And thank you for being here, everyone. It's a Wednesday here, but then it's a wonderful spring afternoon. I hope you can get out and enjoy the weather, at least while it lasts. Our opening words this morning. From the fragmented world of our everyday lives, we gather together in search of wholeness. By many cares and preoccupations, by diverse and sometimes selfish aims, we separate ourselves from one another. However, we know that no branch is utterly severed from the tree of life, of which we all belong.
This is hymn number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song.
Our reading this morning is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It's called Liberation is Costly. Liberation is costly. Even after the Lord had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, they had to travel through the desert. They had to bear the responsibilities and the difficulties of full freedom. There was starvation and thirst, and they kept complaining. They complained that their diet was monotonous. Many of them preferred the days of bondage and the flesh pots of Egypt. We must remember that liberation is costly and it needs unity. We must hold hands and refuse to be divided. We must be ready. And some of us will not see the day of our liberation physically, but those people will have contributed to the struggle. Let us be united. Let us be filled with hope. And let us be those who respect and cherish one another. This is the time in the service when we invite you to share your joys and concerns. Again, this is the way that it's what keeps the cohesiveness of our community together. And so with that in mind, share a joy, a concern, a sorrow. I'd like to just share that again, these last 2 days, today is Wednesday, and of course yesterday, glorious days, and they just change my whole attitude when the sun is out. And despite hay fever and a host of other allergies, I am looking forward to spring. That is my joy this day.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Shorkey, and I have had so much fun this week, and it really has been my joy to put together these chocolate tasting kits. In each kit, there's 10 different types of dark, rich chocolate from around the world, and the very smart and wise bidders at our auction, there's 12 of you, will be joining me on Zoom this afternoon at 4 o'clock for a chocolate tasting. Look forward to seeing you. Bye.
Hi, I'm Evan, and this is Kara, and we have a joy because we got to take a weekend away. We traveled to Pennsylvania, and now we're traveling back. But we got 2 days without the children, which we haven't had in such a long time. But it's been
we love them, but
it's been nice to be away. So that's our joy.
For those of you who, for whatever reason, decided not to share, obviously, you know that's perfectly fine. But just know that we keep you in our hearts and in our minds. We will have our meditation this morning and a time of quiet. So please center yourselves. Spirit of community, in which we share and find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts towards one another, seeking to bring into our circle of concern all who need our love and support. We call into our circle those who are ill, those who are in pain, either in body or in spirit, and those who are lonely, and those who have been wronged. And so it is. It's time for the offertory, and I want to do something before that. I want to thank you ahead of time for your generosity and your gifts. I want to remind you that we are going to be sending out a survey. It will be in tidings and in a blast email. And we want to ask you what you'd like to see done here. Now, we know there's light at the end of the tunnel, there's vaccines, spring is coming. What I want to ask you to do is to participate as much as you can, or as much as you comfortably can. But you will get this survey. It's not long, but I urge you to, of course, participate and fill out the survey. Remember, we want to do what's doable. We still are not meeting in person. Hopefully that will change in the not too distant future. But I urge you to please fill out the survey. Let us hear from you. And with that said, again, thank you for your generosity ahead of time. And with that in mind, we will now receive this morning's offering. Thank you for your gifts. Boy, I've been thinking about this sermon for 4 years. And you know, I go back and forth with the love ethic, and this sermon does include that. I just want you to hear that. But I wanted to go and just lay this out to you. One of our board members I was having a conversation with her. It was Rose. This was several months ago. And we were talking about reaching out, and this was before Biden was president. He was then president-elect. And we were talking about how do we reach out to our fellow Americans who are on a totally different page than we are. And, you know, we were talking, Rose and I, and she said, well, Michael, you know, we still have to try. And I was not advocating that we don't. But then a woman wrote an article that Rose had suggested I read, and it was the seed for this sermon. So again, I've been pondering this topic on and off for the last 4 years, and about how do we deal with our brothers and sisters who, across the aisle, that's a hackneyed term, but across the aisle, in order to promote conversation and possible social change and political action to make this a better nation for all Americans. I've heard some folks in the congregation show much concern about, and even worry, again, about, am I doing enough? How do I do this? I want to be sincere in these efforts. And so before the election, I was concerned that at that time, President-elect Biden would possibly waste precious time trying to convert those who had no interest in unity, much as Obama did at the beginning of his first term in office. And I was troubled when Mitch McConnell and others had said, my job is to make sure that you only do 4 years. And I'm like, well, boy, that's a good way to kick it off, isn't it? thereby continuing to reach across the so-called aisle or political divide. And I said, man, if you keep reaching out, you're going to draw back a nub. Your hand's going to be cut off. For myself, for Michael, it is part of having healthy boundaries and staying healthy emotionally to say that sometimes you've got to move on. To shake the dust off your feet, as it were, and leave a blessing if one is so inclined, as Jesus told his disciples to do when visiting various towns on their journeys and preaching the good news of the gospel. And he told them that those people who do not welcome you, who rebuke you, who refuse to listen to you, they have to be left to their own resources. He told his disciples to shake the dust off their sandals and to move on. So this article that I'm talking about, and I'll be quoting from it, is by a woman by the name of Rebecca Solnick. She wrote this back in November of 2020, and she was talking about meeting Nazis halfway. I've expanded on that. So these are her words. The beginning here. She said, when Trump won the 2016 election, while losing the popular vote, the New York Times seemed obsessed with running features about what Trump voters were feeling and thinking. I remember that. I was reading the Times. She says these pieces treated Trump supporters as both an exotic species and people that it was our job. She's talking about Democrats, liberals, progressives. It was our job to understand. Understand being that word that means both to comprehend and to somehow grant an indulgence to. She says that now that Trump has lost the 2020 election, the LA Times has given their editorial page over to letters from Trump voters who had exactly the sort of predictable things to say that we've been hearing for the more than 4 years. And then she says, thanks to the New York Times and what came to seem like other news outlets hanging on every word of every white supremacist they could convince to go on record. She says the implication is the usual one. We, and she says, these are her words, urban, multi-ethnic, liberal to radical, only partly Christian America, need to spend more time understanding Magna America. The demands do not go the other way, she says. Fox News and Ted Cruz have not chastised their audiences, and I feel pretty confident, she feeling pretty confident, with urgings to enter in discourse. They're not saying you need to talk to people from Black Lives Matter. You're not supposed, they're not encouraging that. They're not encouraging their followers to speak to other rabbis or imams, abortion providers, undocumented valedictorians, or tenured lesbians. When only half the divide is being tasked with making the peace, there is no peace to be made, but, she says, there is a unilateral surrender. We are told to consider this bipartisanship, but the very word means that both sides abandon their partisanship. And Mitch McConnell and company have absolutely no interest in doing that. The assumption is that if Democrats and liberals and progressives simply choose to deploy this powerful tool of respect, then minds will be changed and votes will follow. This, she says, widespread though it may be, this belief is stunningly naive. I'm beginning to believe her. This sense of being disrespected doesn't come from the policies advocated by the Democratic Party and other liberals, and it doesn't come from the things that Democratic politicians say. Oh no. Where does it come from? She says an entire industry that's devoted to convincing white people that liberal elitists look down on them. The right has a gigantic propaganda machine. It has a giant media apparatus that is devoted to convincing people that liberals disrespect them, plus a political party whose leaders all understand that this idea of disrespect is key to their political projects, and so join in the chorus at every opportunity. There's also a devil's bargain in this, she says, that you flatter, and yes, you respect these white people who think this country is theirs by throwing other people under the bus, by disrespecting immigrants and queer people and feminists, and you disrespect their rights and views. It's okay to do that. And you reinforce that constituency sense that they matter more than other people when you pander to them like this. And pretty much all the problems we've faced over the past 4 years, to say nothing of the last 500 years, comes from this sense of certain white people being more important than non-whites, being more important than white liberals, being more important as Christians than non-Christians, native-born than immigrant, male than female, straight than queer, and cisgender than trans. An illustration. You may recall this. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito complained. And he said that you can't say that marriage is a union between one man and one woman anymore. Now that's considered bigotry. This is a standard complaint of the right. See, the real victim is the racist, who has been called a racist, not the victims of his racism. The real oppression is to be impeded in your freedom to oppress. And of course, Alito was disingenuous with this remark. You can say it. You can say that stuff against marriage equality. And he did. Then other people can call you a bigot because they too have their opinions. But in his scheme, such dissent is intolerable. Nevertheless, we get this hopelessly naive version of centrism, of the idea that if we're nicer to the other side, there will be no other side, just kumbaya and one big happy family. This insanity, she writes, is also applied to the questions of belief and fact and principle, with some muddled cocktail of moral relativism. And, you know, the line the therapists give us, everyone's feelings are valid. And that's supposed to be applied to everything. But the truth is not some compromise halfway between the truth and the lie, the fact and the delusion, the scientist and the propagandist. And the ethical is not halfway between white supremacy and human rights activists, rapist and feminist, synagogue people who massacred Jews in synagogues being massacred, xenophobes and immigrants, delusional transphobes and trans people. And here's the question that she poses. She says, who the hell wants unity with Nazis until and unless they stop being Nazis? Who wants unity with white supremacists until they stop being white supremacists? Solnit writes that I've spent much of my adult life watching politicians like Bill Clinton and at times Barack Obama sell out their own side to placate the other with dismal results. End quote. She says, I think our side, if you'll forgive my ongoing shorthand and binary logic, in other words, she says, I think that liberals, progressives, and most Democrats have something to offer everyone, and we can and must win in the long run by offering it. And offering it via better stories and better means to make those stories reach everyone. We actually want to see everyone have a living wage, access to health care, and lives unburdened by medical, student, and housing debt. We want this to be a thriving planet when the babies born this year turn 80 in the year 2100. But the recommended compromise means abandoning and diluting our stories instead of fortifying and improving them, and finding ways for them to actually reach the rest of America rather than having them shut down and warped and shut out altogether. She says, I pray, and I pray with her, that times have changed enough that Joe Biden will not have to do that all over again. And so far he hasn't, but there are 4 more years to go. So don't forget, we have a long way to go, my friends. We have a long ways to go. One of the other problems with this is that one side has a lot of things to do, well, they have a lot of things that do not deserve to be called facts. And their values are too often advocacy for harming many of those who disagree with them. We saw that on steroids on January 6th. Except that one side did have facts, actual facts, notably that Donald J. Trump lost the election and the other had hot and steamy delusions. She writes, I can comprehend, and I do, that lots of people don't believe climate change is real, but is there some great benefit in me listening again to those who refuse to listen to the global community of scientists who see the evidence right before their very eyes, before our very eyes? A lot of why the right doesn't understand climate change, she says, is that climate change tells us everything is what? It's connected. We are all interconnected. Everything we do has far-reaching repercussions, and we're responsible. We are accountable. We are responsible for the whole. And this is a message at odds with their idealization of a version of freedom that seems a lot like disconnection and irresponsibility. But also, climate denial is the result of fossil fuel companies and the politicians that they purchase spreading propaganda and lies for profit. And I understand that better than the people who believe it, she says. She says, if half of us believe the earth is flat, we do not make peace by settling on it being halfway between being round and flat. Those of us who know it's round will not recruit them through compromise. We all know that you do better bringing people out of delusion by being kind and inviting them. You don't want to mock them. But that's inviting them to come over to your side, she says, which is not the same as heading in their direction. Racists shot some Black Lives Matter protesters and plowed their cars into a lot of protesters this past summer. The El Paso anti-immigrant massacre was only a year ago. The Pittsburgh synagogue massacre 2 years ago. The Charlottesville white supremacist rally in which Heather Heyer was killed 3 years ago. And of course, there have been other incidents along the way. Her question is this: do we really need to bridge the divide between Nazis and non-Nazis? Because part of the problem is that we have an appeasement attitude, a system that is supposed to be greased by being nice to the other side. Appeasement didn't work in the 1930s, and it won't work now. Now, that doesn't mean, people, please, it doesn't mean that people have to be angry or to hate back or be hostile. We're not saying that. But it does mean that you have to stand on your principles and defend what's under attack. They do. There are situations in which there is no common ground worth standing on. This is just unfortunate, but it's true. There are situations in which there is no common ground worth standing on, let alone hiking over to. If Nazis wanted to reach out and find common ground and understand us, they probably would not have had the Tiki Torch Parade in Charlottesville full of white men bellowing, "Jews will not replace us." And also, they would not be Nazis. Being Nazis, white supremacists, misogynists, transphobes is all part of a project of refusing to understand as part of refusing to respect. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day before I was going to write this sermon. And we were talking, and she had said to me, I could talk to a white supremacist or a Nazi about, I could talk to them about gardening, we could talk about the weather, we could talk about some things. But she says, I can't get any closer because our moral compasses are too far apart. It is a minority position what these supremacists and Nazis are saying, but by granting deference, we give it over and over the power of a majority opinion, a majority position. In fact, much, if not all, of the Republican Party she writes, since long before Trump, has committed itself to the anti-democratic project of trying to create a narrower electorate as opposed to a wider one. They have invested in voter suppression, especially after Georgia has won. They're already getting ready for the next voting cycle to make it more difficult for people to vote. They have invested in voter suppression as a key tactic to win. And the votes that they try to suppress are those of black voters and other voters of color. Now that is a brutally corrupt refusal to allow those citizens the rights guaranteed to them by law. Having failed to prevent enough black people from voting in the recent election, they are striving mightily to discard those votes after the fact. What do you do with people who think that they matter more than other people? What do you do with that? Catering to them reinforces the belief that they're central to the nation's life, that they are more important, and that their views must prevail. Deference to intolerance only feeds intolerance. She writes, years ago, the linguist George Lakoff wrote that Democrats and liberals operate as kindly, nurturance-oriented mothers to the rest of the population. Republicans are stern, disciple-oriented fathers. But the relationship between the two parties is a marriage between an overly deferential wife and an overbearing and often abusive husband. She says, think about how we got our last two Supreme Court justices and failed to get Merrick Garland. She says, I grew up in an era where wives who were beaten were expected to do more to soothe their husbands and not to challenge them. And this carries on as the degrading politics of our abusive national marriage. Some of us don't know how to win, she says. Others can't believe they ever lost or will lose or should. And this constitutes a kind of threat. And that's why the victors of the recent election are being told in countless ways to go and grovel before the losers. And this unilateral surrender is how misogyny, it's how racism are baked into a lot of liberal and centrist as well as right-wing positions. This idea that some people need to be flattered, even when they are harming the people who are supposed to be doing the flattering and buffering, even when they are in the minority, even when they're breaking the law or lost the election. Lakoff didn't quite get to the point, she says, of saying that this nation lives in a household full of what domestic abuse advocates call coercive control, in which one partner's threats, intimidations, devaluations, and general shouting down control the other. She says this is what marriages were before feminism, with the abused wife urged to placate and soothe the furious husband. It didn't work in marriages, and it never was the abused partner's job to prevent the abuse by surrendering and giving up their voice. It is not working as a national policy either. Now is an excellent time to stand on principle and to defend what we value. And she says, I believe it's a winning strategy too. Or at least it can bring us closer to winning than surrender does. Also, it's worth repeating. Democrats won. And being gracious in victory is still being victorious. If not for the pandemic, Donald Trump and his ideology may have won a second term. And another more charismatic, a more suave and less crude authoritarian candidate may still arise in the future. Cliches about unity can ring hollow at a time like this. Americans cannot be unified until people confront things that should not be negotiated, like climate change, like scientific truths, like racism. King said that we must never adjust ourselves to inequality, economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. If this is being normal, he said, let me be maladjusted. After much thinking and studying, I'm talking about myself now, and personally, I've always wanted and still tried to reach out to build bridges instead of walls. But you know what? I'm getting it on a deeper level. I cannot do it alone. I cannot do it if the other side is not willing. I can affirm your humanity. I can live the first principle. I can assist as one human being to another when the need arises. But we have two different moralities. Our moral compasses are too different. And there's some things that I just cannot compromise. You cannot have unity without truth. Sometimes one must face the fact that there are people who do not want to live in the world that I envision. Because I'm guessing it's because it's a place where old hierarchies are challenged and you can't say anything you want without having consequences. I have to get it that there's some people who don't want to live in that kind of world. Some folks believe that they are expected to forgive too much in the name of unity. It's tragic, but it's true. King reminds us that the ultimate measure of a human being is not where you stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where one stands at times of challenge and controversy. Sometimes, though, you just have to shake the dust off your feet and move on.
This is hymn number 348, Guide My Feet.
Our closing words. We have been blessed this morning by who we are and by the hope and promise inherent in the community that we are striving to build here. Remember that hope and promise. Remember that you are a unique part of it and a needed part of it. Live its beauty. Tell its story. Go in peace. Amen.